I'm assuming that many of you are puzzled by the fact that a European is talking on behalf of a Southern African NGO. I think I represent a dilemma many of you, even here, you in the 3rd row, in the 5th row, in the 15th row, you represent the same dilemma. And I think I would like to present some of my thoughts of how we can collectively resolve this dilemma as a global civil society in international development. I think there's a number of issues I would like to talk about. The main issue is that it is impossible for Southern NGOs to thrive and to grow. So I'm trying to make 6 points here. We understand that donors have the constraints of having to find the right channel of making development aid go to the South. But I think there's too many layers in this system. There's international NGOs, there's vertical funds, there is international consulting firms, there is international academic institutions. Then at the lower end, you have local NGOs, you have as well-established NGOs, you have local consultancy firms, you have local academic institutions, you have branches of international NGOs. All of them benefit from a system, and at the very end of the supply chains, you have local NGOs that receive most of the time very, very little from the aid budget because each intermediary takes off a fair share to cover its own operations. In the Global Humanitarian Assistance Report of 2018, it was made very clear that Southern NGOs only take 0.3% of humanitarian aid. There is the issue of compliance principles, log frames, indicators, objectives, value for money, name it. These kind of issues have to be taken so serious for Southern NGOs that it absorbs all their time. They don't have time to actually deal with the people they are supposed to serve. We at ZGF, we have administered many calls for proposals, and I think roughly 1,000 applications have gone through our system. However, I've become the biggest doubter of the value of calls for proposals. Let me explain why. First of all, they create an unnecessary competitiveness amongst local NGOs. All of a sudden, they're put in a situation that I have to compete against my buddy. I think it's wrong. We're not in the private sector. The smartest NGOs will always get the big part of the cake because they are brilliant in proposal writing. I believe that well-written proposals are not the best proposals because they don't say anything about the motivation and the leadership of the people managing those NGOs. The situation gets even worse when international NGOs are made to compete against local NGOs. We have seen situations where calls for proposals triggered the flying in of international NGOs into Zambia, making them to open office once they have received a grant, close down the office when the project is over. What has this done for local NGOs? Very, very little. Secondly, my big point is that international NGOs should not compete with local NGOs for private sector money, under their corporate social responsibility portfolio. Particularly not those international NGOs that have no legal basis in country, that are not registered, available to any of the registration options they have, because I think they should simply stay away and leave the space to local NGOs. Because it's very simple, international NGOs are supported by a big marketing machinery. They have a fundraising support from Washington, from Brussels, from London. Local NGOs don't have that kind of support. And it's a little bit pathetic to put those two organizations on the same level. So I think it's a little bit unfair. There's this notion of short-term funding or the short-term vision of international donors. what it actually does to local NGOs, it makes them behave like chameleons, because they change the color depending on what temperature they're exposed to. And I think this is one of the biggest criticisms, because NGOs are being made to shift their focus or tweak their focus wherever, depending where the money comes from. There's also other new players in this arena, and these ones are the new philanthropic organizations, the social impact investors, or private sector foundations. This is a whole new world that's totally inaccessible or incomprehensible to local NGOs. Why is that? From my own experience, if you open up a website, you have to scroll through a long website, only to find out at the very end that you're being told, don't even bother, we do not receive unsolicited proposals. Second one, general inquiries never receive any responses. Just to understand, is this something you, as a philanthropic organization, would you fund? No response. Or is there another option? I'm not sure. I think those ones who are very honest about what the probability is to actually get funding, I think this is a much better honest option. At least if you're being told, if you scroll down, 10% of the applications are actually successful. I think it's much more honest than being, not receiving any response at all. The alternative for local civil society organizations is in the South is to create visibility. But do local NGOs have the kind of visibility? Do they have the kind of infrastructure, ICT infrastructure? Do they have the kind of understanding of how to use social media? Do they have the money to actually afford very expensive internet services? What are they going to do about this? I think many of the local NGOs are left out because they simply don't have the capacity in terms of ICT infrastructure. I have worked in this system for the last 20 plus years, and I have seen it from all aspects. I have seen it from the European NGO side. I've seen it from the perspective of the aid department. I've seen the system as a consultant for multilateral organizations, bilateral organizations, until I ended up being the director of a local NGO. And I think, as a manager of a local funded organization, I have seen how the power dynamics actually play out as an organization that sits at the receiving end of the entire development aid supply chain. I have been part of this system and helped to shape the system and many of its programs. But by sitting at the receiving end, it makes me feel very increasingly irritated. And it makes me feel very uneasy. However, there's hope in Africa. There's a new breed of organizations, the community development organizations, the likes of the Kenya Community Development Foundation, the Uluntu Foundation in Zimbabwe, or the Community Foundation of the Western region in Zimbabwe, supported by organizations like, for example, Trust Africa or the Global Fund for Community Foundation. They have been there, there's few of them, they continue and to inspire us at ZGF. Like us, they believe in local asset building. They believe that the communities and the citizens are the critical source that we should actually focus on. They believe that there's an alternative to this system, and they believe we need to unlock the powers of the citizens, of the people as a collective, and the communities. They also look for new ways of making sense of the system. They go with the pace of the citizens, they adapt to the pace of how the citizens make decisions about their own development. They listen to them, they try to help them, and if it takes 2 years to make them understand how they can move on taking their own pace, they will do that. And this is the kind of civil society that will be resilient, because they will continue to be there if they're under political attack, and if there's an economic and social crisis. This kind of community philanthropy organizations have a critical role to play because they have understood they can support local civil society organizations to take care of themselves. We at ZGF, we are the toddlers amongst these kind of organizations. And we are aware that moving from a donor-funded organization to become a community philanthropy organization, it's not going to be easy, it's going to be rough, and it's not going to be straightforward. And what should be my role in all of this? We are part of the hashtag Shift the Power movement, and I think my role is here to help shift the power. Thank you very much.